The nationwide uprising of the Iranian people in more than 150 cities in November 2019 shook the very foundation of the mullah's regime. The protesters, who according to the regime itself, clashed with repressive forces in more than 900 locations, expressed their desire to overthrow the theocracy on the direct orders of the mullah's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. The Revolutionary Guards shot defenseless people from the ground and the air. The People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, PMOI, MEK, reported from inside the country that at least 1,500 protesters, including 27 teenagers, were martyred. More than 12,000 people were arrested. Reuters news agency and the US Secretary of State subsequently confirmed the casualty figures. Even earlier in 2018 and 2019, Iran had already witnessed a series of widespread social uprising and protests. On September 2, 2020, Amnesty International released an 80-page report detailing widespread torture, enforced disappearances, unfair trials, and death sentences based on forced confessions obtained after torturing those arrested during the November 2019 nationwide protests. These barbaric tortures included flogging, electric shocks, hanging from the leg or arm for long periods of time, waterboarding, mock executions, and sexual violence. The mullah's regime, which today is at its weakest position, has realized that only one way to survive is to step up its intimidation and repression. Since the mullahs are unable to meet the basic demands of the Iranian people, regime officials have issued stern public warnings that much larger popular uprisings lurk on the horizon.
After signing the JCPOA nuclear agreement and adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, the international community anticipated an end to the clerical regime's regional adventurism and export of terror. But on the contrary, the mullahs rather intensified their regional transgressions and the export of terrorism since that period. The massacres in Syria were intensified through the direct intervention of the IRGC's Quds Force. In July 2019, Saudi oil facilities were targeted by missiles fired by the mullahs regime. Oil tankers in the Persian Gulf came under the regime's terrorist attacks. The arming of the Houthis in Yemen was intensified, especially with the supply of missiles and drones, which turned out to be the main instruments for the continuation of the war in that country. The assassination of political opponents, a core policy of the mullah's regime since the outset, has reached new heights in the last 2 years. Asada Asadi, the third secretary of the mullah's embassy in Vienna, was arrested after he masterminded a plot to bomb the Free Iran opposition gathering in Paris in 2018. Asada's terrorist accomplices were also arrested before heading to Paris to execute the bombing. The explosives in the trunk of their car were defused by authorities. The decision to carry out the bombing was made at the highest levels of the regime in Tehran. France and the European Union have listed Asada and the regime's deputy intelligence minister as terrorists. Despite the regime's intensive blackmail tactics in the last 2 years to secure Asada's release, his trial, along with that of 3 accompanying terrorists, will soon commence in Belgium. A few months earlier, In March 2018, another bombing plot by the Iranian regime against the MEK's Persian New Year celebration in Tirana was foiled by Albanian police. Mrs. Rajavi and Mayor Giuliani were both present at the event. Subsequently, Albania expelled the regime's ambassador and several of its diplomats. Over the past 2 years, senior regime diplomats have been expelled or pursued on terrorism charges in France, the Netherlands, and Turkey. The mullahs have clearly entered a new phase of terrorism and warmongering.
Nationwide uprisings in the past 2.5 years have brought the prospects for the Iranian people's victory over the mullahs' regime closer than ever before. With the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic and its spread in Iran, Khamenei described this catastrophe as an opportunity. By following the strategy of mass casualties, Khamenei sought to create a barrier against the uprising to overthrow the regime. More than 100,000 people have lost their lives because of the regime's cover-up, incompetence, mismanagement, and rampant corruption. Nevertheless, the resistance units, acting as an organised force, challenged this tactic by regime, and despite the risks and dangers emanating from the coronavirus, stepped up their activities against the atmosphere of repression nationwide. Resistance units are comprised of MEK supporters across Iran, who continue the proud legacy of the fight for freedom in Iran. Resistance units write graffiti on walls, post messages of the Iranian resistance's leadership in public areas, and torch regime's posters to break the spell of repression. They are determined and willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to save their people from poverty, unemployment, and suppression. The regime has resorted to extensive repressive actions in fear of the increasing trend of young people joining the resistance units. Regime leaders have admitted to their decisive role in the November 2019 uprisings, and on May 17, 2020, the mullah's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, warned the young people against joining the MEK. Expand the revolution's front as much as you can, and recruit the youth. Of course, I do not mean recruiting the MEK. In the historic battle the Iranian people have waged against the ruling theocracy, the resistance units are the harbingers of freedom and democracy, and played unrivaled role in writing Iran's destiny.